buono così.
Bom, boa tarde. Primeiro de tudo é um prazer receber o amigo e às vezes chefe, Matteo Ghidoni, aqui. A gente está roubando um pouco do tempo de férias dele aqui no Brasil para apresentar uma série de trabalhos que não necessariamente tem a ver com o que está exposto aqui, mas com certeza se entrelaçam com toda a produção que ele vem desenvolvendo com o Salottobuono, que é um escritório fundado por ele, em Milão. E, bom, mais do que isso, acho que é muito importante o fato de a gente ter feito o esforço de organizar essa exposição, que é de um todo inédito para a produção de Salottobuono, porque jamais tinha sido reunido tantos projetos assim, em uma exposição solo, e as fotos também são divulgadas e estão disponíveis no site e tudo mais, mas nunca tinham sido reunidas assim. Enfim, eu acho que o Matteo não precisa de muita introdução, mas eu acho que é de uma grande sorte a gente ter ele aqui para mostrar um pouco da produção ao público de São Paulo, que não é exatamente, mas enfim, a conversa está sendo gravada, vai ser disponibilizada depois. E eu acho que não merece grandes outras produções, eu acho que depois vai abrir a conversa, e a conversa é de um todo informal, por mais que tenha essas formalidades todas, então sintam-se à vontade para interromper e perguntar. Em português, a gente traduz, eu acho que ele pode estar entendendo também.
Então, mas a ideia é que o Matteo vai fazer uma apresentaçãozinha de I'm gonna present 3 projects, right?
Yeah, 3 projects.
Que alguns deles estão aqui, outros não, mas que eles têm uma linha narrativa, que estão um pouco nessa exposição e um pouco na publicação. Acho que é legal a gente apresentar também a publicação. A gente fez um livrinho que são os projetos que estão aqui, mas diferente de como está exposto, que tipo, essas imagens e os textos originais são acessíveis no site, enfim, tem um banco de dados em outros lugares. E aí a gente resolveu publicar essa versão que, enfim, tem uma... A gente trabalhou ela, a gente traduziu os textos para português, a gente não é escritor, a gente não é... somos arquitetos, então eventuais falhas estão aí. E também teve um trabalho gráfico legal do nosso amigo João Pedro, que ainda não chegou. Mas então essas imagens ele fez o trabalho de tentar deixar elas no mesmo tom, assim. E vocês podem ver a publicação depois. Ela tem um encarte também, que são os textos originais, então a gente quis deixar esses dois universos, as fotos trabalhadas e os textos trabalhados estão no caderninho. A gente já está vendo dentro. E os originais estão dentro desse encarte aqui. O Matteo estava falando exatamente isso, que tipo, é para ter uma ideia mais de conversa do que de palestra. Então ele vai falar desses 3 projetos, mas a qualquer hora pode interromper e conversar. Acho que a gente vai estar gravando isso para depois editar, traduzir e publicar, que é uma coisa que a gente fez no começo do ano já, quando veio a Abdel Kader e o David, que são caras que dirigem centros de arquitetura também na Itália e na França. E a gente, enfim, quer dar umas boas-vindas, dizer que esse espaço, a gente entende a nossa prática.
Na época a gente não se entendia, mas ainda não era entendido como um escritório de arquitetura, o que agora somos. E esse acontecimento é o segundo do ano, mas é um em uma sequência de eventos planejados para esse semestre, então a gente espera que aconteça mais coisas desse tipo e que a gente vê com muito bons olhos pra cá e tudo mais, e vale super o esforço de organizar e chamar a gente assim.
E essa parte que o Luiz estava falando, que tipo, além da relevância dos trabalhos por si, tem também um lado, sei lá, afetivo. O Luiz trabalhou com o Matteo por um semestre, no período de vivência da escola. Eu também pude trabalhar em um projeto com o Matteo, quando eu estava trabalhando em outro escritório francês. Então a gente está, sei lá, muita vontade, só tem amigo aqui, acho que a ideia é ser uma coisa divertida também. Pode começar.
É isso. Prego.
Thank you. I don't know what you have said, but I understood that you had fun in Italy and France where we were. No, thanks, CLUBE A, for this kind of invitation and for the possibility to show the project here. And thanks to all the people that collaborated with you to the preparation of this event and this exhibition, because I think there have been a lot of work, and I see it a little bit more like the work of CLUBE A using the project of Salottobuono rather than the exhibition of an exhibition of mine. Mm-hmm. Even if I have to say that it's the first time, as we were saying yesterday, it's the first time that I managed to have 7 projects or few projects together in a sort of exhibition, beautiful exhibition that is distributed in these spaces of work, so interfering a bit with the spaces of work, and it's the first time for me to have this kind of personal show. No? So it's that makes me think about the meaning of it. No? What do these projects have in common? What is the meaning of all this, or putting them together? That was a bit improvised, but while we were doing it, we discovered some relationship between the projects and so on. And you know, the title "Rooms, etc." is a manifestation of this, of the fact that you will not find a sort of precise catalog of things, or a precise, let's say, well-organized taxonomy of things. It's rooms, it talks about rooms, but also something else, let's say. And what does it talk about? I don't know, for me, these are projects that I have done recently. They are very diverse in the sense that they come from many different occasions. Some of them are competition projects, some of them have been built, some other are just free speculations on something. And I think there was a good response from your side to make them even more heterogeneous, no, in the use of media and in the way you place them in the space. They all talk about forms of collaboration that I had with other architects and with photographers. They are also homogeneous in terms of media, in the sense that they are all represented here as pictures of models, which is, let's say, a technique that I am recently very interested in, and we can maybe later talk about. But that also questions the authorship of the project and the authorship of the image that comes from professional photographers that have their own poetics, their own vision, and so on. And then, well, finally, they are all more or less about rooms. I discovered, like, analyzing myself, my work recently, I discovered that I was working all the time on the idea of rooms and on this, let's say, almost ontological idea of a space that is defined by the exclusion of something and inclusion of something else. No, it's all about spaces that somehow makes a clear difference between what is inside and what is outside. And it's also interesting to be here and talk about it in a city where the architecture, the Paulista architecture, was always about trying to include the public space, trying to make it to make this boundary as open as possible, no, as fluid as possible. While I realized that I worked a lot on a specific division between inside and outside, and maybe we can start talking about some projects. I will only show 3 projects, and this is the case. For instance, this division, this clear separation, is a case of a project that I produced as a response to a competition brief launched by Arquitetura. Arquitetura, maybe you are familiar with this magazine. It's a Mexican magazine of architecture that since few years organizes a festival called Mextropoli in Mexico City. It's a festival about the city, about the metropolis and the Mexican metropolis, and how architecture and the metropolitan sphere, let's say, go together and collaborate. So, since a few years, they launched this competition for the design of the Mextropoli Pavilion. And we found the brief of the competition. I did it together with a friend of mine called Enrico Dusi. We worked together on a few projects recently. We found the brief of the competition interesting because they specified the size of the pavilion, let's say some dimensions, some maximum dimensions, and so on, but they didn't really specify the use and let's say the sort of activity that were going to take place in it. So the Mextropoli Pavilion should represent, somehow be an icon, be a sort of central point of all the communication of the Mextropoli Festival that takes place in many areas of the city, but also in a very central place called Alameda Central. It's a central park in Mexico City where there is a theater, where all the events took place, and there are other pavilions and so on. And then you have the Mextropoli Pavilion that has to represent the festival, but how? It's not specified the function of it. Our approach was to try to not make this function specific, no? To just work on this indeterminacy and just work on the idea of a space that is separated from the outer space of the metropolis. We wanted to create a small region where the urban pressure of the city was going to be absorbed and somehow temporarily suspended for a while in this 43 square meters of space, surrounded by a triangular wall that is 4 meters high and 12 meters long on each side, and it had one entrance that is more like a rabbit hole, or not proper entrance, and the little porthole. And then we participated in a competition producing these images, and maybe it was the first time that I really felt I don't know, satisfied with the final result of a visualization of the project, in a sense that for many years I worked a lot on drawings and I don't know, they can reach a level of beauty, but somehow you feel in the end that they will not be so emotionally communicative to the people that sees them. In this case, we wanted to work with Louis de Belle, a photographer, and after building this 1 to 20 model, so it was, I don't know, 60 centimeter long side, we produced these images, no? And we produced this sort of promenade of, I don't know, path going into the building as we imagine it. So we imagine a building that from outside is completely normal, not completely banal, in a sense that is built with blocks, with concrete blocks, which is maybe the material with which 90% of Mexico City is built. And we wanted to use this most banal and most non-beautiful material to build our space. It's not even a building, it's just an enclosure, no? An enclosure. On the outside you can use it in many ways. You can place the advertisement, place the posters of the Mextropoli Festival and so on. But eventually we imagined that it could be just vandalized and freely taken by the people. And then when you pass inside, there is this sort of inversion, no? So the interior walls are painted in pink, and there is this artificial garden, let's say, artificial hill of sand with cacti on top. Now you imagine that this is a sort of very, very stereotypical image that we can have as Italians towards Mexico City or towards Mexico or Latin America in general. And also the cacti, the pink wall, the blue sky, the sand, and so on. But also it's constructed also on some image of the Mexican modernism, no? If you think about Barragan walls and just trying to turn it not upside down, but inside out, no? To make the architecture frame the garden, no? This sort of open air room. So it's an open air room that then you climb the hill, you can look through the porthole and so on. Then you see the entrance again, and you go outside again, and you can have many things happening around that are not controlled by us. There is a certain degree of indeterminacy. We wanted to transform this generosity in a sort of generosity, you know, towards the population. Then what is interesting is also the fact that as many competition briefs now ask to make an architecture that is reversible, that is somehow reusable, dismantleable and remountable somewhere else and so on. And we stated really precisely that we didn't want to produce this kind of architecture made of wooden pallet or stuff like that. We want to make walls, and if this architecture has to be reused, it's just reused as it is, no? And when the festival is over, people will use them. We use it as they like. So we had a series of critics when we published the result of the competition, because that was a time when Trump was really promoting his idea of reinforcing and building the wall between Mexico and the United States, and so every wall you propose, it immediately becomes a symbol of exclusion, of division, of power and oppression against the population. I mean, of course, a wall can be this thing, but it can also be a completely different thing. And in our case, I think it just prompted new possibilities into the city. So these guys were playing around in the around the bars, and when they found this spot where the opening was going to take place, they just took the chance to come there and play, and somehow enriching the idea of the opening that we were going to do. I'll show you this quick video that is just another interpretation of our pavilion that was made by a young architect, Juan Benavides. So it's another, let's say, form of collaboration that was not expected, in the sense that he just happened to pass by, and he's really fond of architectural movies, and so he shot this brief video that later on he sent to us. It's a moment in which the city is is waking up. It's very early in the morning, so you see no people around, but this is a place where during the weekend, like 1 million of people pass by. So you see that it's just the beginning of the day. You notice also that we didn't finally use concrete blocks, but bricks. And this is because the main sponsor, we found out when we went there that the main sponsor was producing bricks, and so we had to change the idea about the material, but in my opinion it didn't change a lot in terms of the effect. So this is the space. Somebody is having morning jogging. But I like this video because I think without any indication from our side, he just captured some of the main features of the pavilion and main intentions. And I think the main intention is really at the end of the movie when you see this, like the separation that the pavilion tries to establish between the city and the interior space. So here are some pictures. They finally hung the hoop. They played there, and but as you see, we were not afraid that the pavilion was going to be damaged, but the organizers kept saying, "Oh, be careful! Like the first day, they will spray it, they will make graffiti on it." And we said, "Okay, fantastic! No, it's what we like. Let's try to preserve the interior as it is, but on the outer walls, they are available for everybody." But in fact, the citizens didn't touch it. Like it was a sort of disappointment for us, but it was kept like beautiful as it was built. I don't know if they put guards or something else. Besides this idea of the separation between interior and exterior space, I think a lot of these works try to investigate one question. They are more or less all temporary pavilions, and they are meant to host cultural activities, performances, events, and so on. So the main question, again, that is around these works is what is the meaning today of going physically to a place where something is taking place, instead of watching it streaming online or just seeing a podcast, hearing a podcast, or so on. Just what is the actual meaning of being physically present in the space where the event takes place, one-to-one. And that was a question that was always present while doing this second project, the Teatrino. When I was commissioned to design and build a pavilion for the interviews that eFlux, that is a platform of contemporary art that now has a section on architecture, contemporary architecture. They were going in Milan to have a program of interviews with architects in the frame of the so-called Art Week. Art Week is one of the many weeks of Milan. You have the Fashion Week, the Art Week, the Photo Week, and so on. And now, just since 3 or 4 years, you have the Art Week, which is taking place in the building of the Triennale in Milan. So just near to the building of the Triennale, they wanted to build this small pavilion where the big superstar architects, after having their own big lectures, conferences in the building of the Triennale, in the Palace of the Arts, in the, let's say, institution, they could be just taken to another place, a more intimate, a more small-scale pavilion where they could have a more intimate conversation about their work, their life, their beliefs, and so on. Together with the curators of IFLAX, Nicholas Hirsch and Nick Axel. So when I was asked to do this kind of space, I started to think about the different possibilities of organizing an interview and what are the modes of the interview that are possible today, and what is the physical, let's say, what is the physical organization of the interview? What kind of layout can have? And I looked into many programs of the national television in Italy, of the Rai television. One of them is a very famous interview format is this Mezzanotte e dintorni with this guy, Gigi Marzullo, interviewing an actress here, a famous actress. And you see that the space of the interview here is just a constructed space just for the television, so there is no public around, but they try to construct the three-dimensionality of this space. The camera goes around and tries to reconstruct this, let's say, paradox of a very intimate conversation for a public of millions of people that are watching the TV during the night. No? Then another possible space was this, with three interviewer, and another subject, all together in a conversation with the I don't know, we call it the giraffe microphone, capturing the voices of them, but also of the people, of the public, that forms a sort of very close background to the scene. So there is this microphone, the public can intervene in the conversation, they can debate, they can contradict, and they do some, I don't know, it would be impossible today to see in the national television somebody in the studio lighting up the cigarette, smoking in the studio, and that was part of the thing and on the conversation. Then we have this like the body in the interview process is taken to extreme conditions in the marathons, such as the one organized by Obrist and Colas at the Serpentine Gallery. But you have on the opposite, like the complete erasure of the body of the interviewee, such as in the mafia processes, when you have the mafia repentants giving their witness, and they just hear the voice, and the body of the interviewee is completely cancelled. And finally, I mean, going through these different forms of the interview and wondering what could be a possible way of organizing a space that is not frontal, where you have a staged interview and the public as a passive actor. I was thinking about, of course, of these examples of the anatomical theater. This is the anatomical theater in Padua that Rossi already talks about in his book, the scientific autobiography. And this is the space where you can consider the interview as an extreme form of almost of sectioning of the corpse of the subject. You make section through his work, through his life. It's a sort of autopsy, let's say, with the living character. So all the students sit around the space and look at the center where you have the autopsy taking place. So that was an interesting example for me when we passed from let's say, the scene of the interview to the space of the interview. Of course, the reference to Rossi, then there is also this idea of the theater of Rossi, and I mean this. He talks a lot about the teatrinos in his books, and he explains also the fact that the diminutive name teatrino instead of theater, like little theater, is not in his case let's say, a playful or a sort of childish act. No, it was more like talking about structures that become part of our daily experience, of our that become familiar. No, and he looks at these examples of wooden theaters, such as the theater in Padua. So I started to think about this space with a very steep. It became steeper then, but a quite steep arena in which all the people, like interviewer, and public are immersed all together as a sort of big pool. And then, yeah, and then also about this idea that the little ball on the top of the Teatro del Mondo could be inflated and expand until it just fly away, or suspend the roof of the theater, and as in this case. Then the Teatrino. Well, these were other studies. No, finding this painting that. Well, I just completed with the ball. This is all Louis studies on pyramids. No, for me the interesting idea was the idea that this pyramid is not symmetrical; it's constantly changing the shape. So I imagine something like this for our inflatable aerostatic structure. Series of models. This project is not included in this exhibition, but I don't know, somehow there are something in the locus solus that formally then conduct to this idea, the theater and then this sort of cone on top. This is the final plan of the Teatrino. It's 7.5 meter in diameter, so it's quite a small compressed space, but it can contain up to 90 persons, 90 visitors. It has two entrances, and you access it through small stairs. And this is the section. But then you have to see like the section in relationship to the body of the building of the Triennale. In the beginning, they wanted me to build this pavilion in the back garden of the Triennale, but I made a fight because I wanted to have it in front of the Triennale as a sort of baptistry in front of the cathedral, let's say, something that could spill out and go into the city and not being trapped into the garden in the rear. So the relationship in plan and also in section with the Triennale. And you see that this, like the balloon and the aerostatic structure, function as the element that can bridge the scale between the smaller scale of this space where the event is taking place and the bigger scale of the Triennale. So this was the opening of the Teatrino. Seen from the Triennale offices, so from the building onto the space of the streets of the city. So it's the really first time when we saw the structure in function, after. The balloon is 5 meters wide in diameter, so it can develop an upward force of 43 kilos, and the total weight of the structure of the roof is 16 kilos, more or less. It's done with a very light fabric, the aerostatic, the one you make for parachutes. So it's very light, and this difference in forces, of course, creates the possibility of having the roof up. But then it was subject to, I don't know, to the winds, to the changing, let's say, weather and so on. The main problem was the wind. So since the people in the Triennale were afraid that during the night a strong wind could just make it fly away, we started every night to take the balloon down, and in the morning we have the balloon raising that somehow marked the opening of the Teatrino each day. It was meant to stay 1 week, and then they prolonged its existence for a whole summer, and during the summer we organized a format together with Marzia, a format that was more or less trying to mimic some of the TV formats. It was called Varietà, including many things. Yeah, this is seen from the street in relationship to the building. The interior was really like cheap wood, nothing particularly designed, but the idea was to have these two halls, two entrances on axis with the street, so it was possible to see through, more or less. We had the big stars, like when it was completely full. The other nice idea is that the microphone hanged from the top of the roof. So from you see this line, it was attached to the balloon, and then you have, like in these Baroque churches, where you have the lamps that start from the top of the cupola and then come almost until the floor. No, that was the same, because the interviewer and interviewer sit, and I mean the interview takes place in the bottom of this cavea, and all the other people sit around. So they start from here, and this was seen from the offices of the Triennale. So for a few months, these workers had this new, let's say, feature in their landscape. Yeah, then the last project is a slightly different one, in the sense that it's a completely different scale, and it's I would say it's not even my project. It's more like a project of this guy, Ferdinando Fuga, that is the architect of this building. This building is the so-called Albergo dei Poveri, like the poor hotel that Ferdinando Fuga built in 1730s, more or less, for the Borbone family in Naples, because there was this huge problem of the quantity of poor people flooding the streets of Naples at that time, and the Borbone, like the kings wanted, like, as a sort of act towards the city, since like their idea of expansion was already had already taken place, and now the new problem was the population management. No? How do you deal with this big population, this quantity of people? There was a huge quantity of poors in the streets of Naples, and they wanted to make this, let's say, this bunch of people somehow controllable and visible. No? So they invented the Albergo dei Poveri, and Ferdinando Fuga built it. Was an incredible building, 600 meters long in the project, but then only 3 courtyards were built, and it's still incomplete. Where you had, I don't know, males on one side, females on the other side, youngs on one floor, old elderly on the other floor, and so on. It was really a machine that separated took this body, this social body, and fragmented it into almost like into homogeneous classes, no? And then they were taken there to have a bit of work in exchange of a bit of behavior. No, they didn't have to create problems and so on. And the place where they virtually met was this central church with 6 axes, but on one there was the let's say the parents, not the parents, the relatives of these people when they had them, and then the 4 classes of people meet virtually, like just with the gaze of in the central altar where the priest gave the mass. Well, you see this building, this incredible building, in the map of the Duke of Noia of 1750. And you see that there is this other little building, a square. It's a 80 by 80 square plot, 80 by 80 meter. There was sort of counterpart of this first building because it was a cemetery. So when these poor people died, then they were brought to the cemetery, and it was a sort of mass cemetery. You know, they didn't have, let's say, families. They didn't have the possibility of being buried in a single tomb. So it was a sort of mass cemetery, but organized in a very specific way. It was called the Cemetery of 366 Graves, or fosse, because this was the number of fosse that was corresponding to the number of days of the year, including the leap year, organized in a 90 by 90 grid, and you just saw the numbers of the fosse on the floor. So it started with number 1 here, number 2, 3, 4, and then the numeration snakes back and forth like a plug on the field. No, it's called bustophredionic order. It's the same that when you work in the field, you do. No, and there is a central lamp, and this central lamp is somehow alimented by the fluids of the corpses going away, being expelled in the cemetery. So this is the plan of the foundation of the cemetery. You see that the building in itself is nothing but the fence that surrounds this square field, and then there is a thin building on this side for the main functions like the priest and the preparation of the bodies and so on. And then, underground is just this grid of walls that form the foundations of the building, but also frame the pits, the 366 pits. So each day, one of these pits was open, the bodies were thrown in, and then it was closed in the night to remain so for an entire year. For like day 2, we pass to pit number 2, day 3, and so on. So it's a very rational, almost scarily rational machine, that processes dead bodies, but at the same time, it's giving back a sort of chart of or a diagram of a population. So the milieu of the poor that was created with Albergo dei Poveri was somehow consolidated in the cemetery once the poor were dead. And this section is interesting because it shows a sort of burying machine that was donated by a Spanish noblewoman to the cemetery. Because she was horrified by hearing the sound, let's say the thud on the bottom of the pit of the body that were thrown in. So she gave this, this machine with the wheel that somehow places the body gently down, erasing also this last element of emotion. So it became a completely, totally dry and rational machine that didn't have to do, in which the death didn't have to do anything with emotions, just with sort of processing of a specific function. So this machine moved like a cursor on the field, somehow erasing this last element of emotion. Now the cemetery is in these conditions. You can still see the cover of the pits with the different numbers, but it became, after a while, I don't know, in the 19th century, it was used. Like the use was changed. They started to bury people in the walls, somehow violating violating the original idea. And the plants started to grow. The lamp was substituted with palm that then died for parasites and so on. A few years ago, I simply tried to scale this building 5,000 times and to place it in an area of the Mediterranean, let's say where you have a daily death of many poor people, an area that is the Strait of Sicily, in between Tunisia, Sicily, Libya, and so on, where you have the main migratory flow from Africa to Europe. Then this square that becomes 400 by 400 kilometers is deformed by the coast, by the geography, and we can imagine to reinstall the same system of numeration in this place, and it becomes let's say another project that I cannot consider completely mine, and it's not maybe even a project. It's something that mixes and overlaps the architectural scale with the landscape scale, with the territorial scale, and it becomes a sort of ambiguous object, you know, in which all these scales overlap, but somehow formulates an idea of a monument that is so difficult to somehow formulate nowadays in our society. It's a monument for Europe, maybe a monument that Europe should think about in that area of the world, and basically as every monument, its main function is to work against oblivion, to oblige us and the future generation to remember. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So since nobody asked or interrupted you, I would like to start this conversation.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe if I am not wrong, I think the name of your office, Salottobuono, has something to do with this talk too. If you could explain it to us.
Salottobuono.
Yeah.
Salottobuono is a bit like CLUBE A, no? It's a club. The name Salottobuono was, let's say, invented in the 80s in Milan. Actually, Salottobuono is the idea of the good living room, the living room where you accept the guests. No? So our grandparents always have the Salottobuono, the good living room where they keep the sofa under the plastic, you know, and they open it just when they have to receive somebody really important. But in the 80s, this name was used to describe a certain connection between a cultural milieu and a political one and an industrial one in the city of Milan. So you had, for instance, Marta Marzotto was this woman that invited in her living room, in her salotto, politicians, industrialists, I don't know, to talk about the future of the country, to rule, let's say, in a sort of hidden underground way to decide the destiny of the country. In our case, I mean, in my case, the word Salottobuono is, of course, a joke that relates to that context, but more simply is the fact that the office started in my living room, and in the beginning it was a series of meetings happening in the living room that tried to establish an exchange of ideas between colleagues working in the architectural field, making competitions and so on, and tried to exchange. So it was a way to start a conversation. Then it got a bit more formalized when we started to work really on projects. So it became a banal office, let's say, but it started as Salottobuono.
Não sei se alguém tem alguma also the name of Salottobuono and your practice is also like very strict to theoretical tradition that you endorse in some way, and then and also refers itself to form, as in the way of not being inventive, in the sense of responding to the exhaustion of formal solutions past the last years and so on, but also referring itself to being kind of dogmatic in the sense of responding to the heritage of the discipline and the legacy of the discipline as well. I was just wondering if you could comment on that, and even because there's like a pity that we couldn't put our text in the translated version in the poster.
But everybody could read the original
everybody
one.
read, unless you.
No. So if you want to tell me what's written.
Because like what we try to establish is that we started the test with a quoting of Nicolau, saying that more or less San Rocco established a group of people, a group of practicing and theoretical architects that responds to a common ground of theoretical. And then I don't know. I think you understood what I mean. And then
the statement is of Niccolò Ornaghi is a bit more critical in the sense that he says that San Rocco is a magazine that I contributed to establish together with other colleagues, with other offices. So there is Salottobuono inside San Rocco, but there are other groups like Baucu, 2APP, Office, Castanguers, and so on. And what Niccolò said in his article, that was not really an article, was like an obituary for the death of San Rocco that now reached his final issue. And it was meant to be like this, like we started the magazine knowing that we were going to end it in a few years. He said that San Rocco contributed to form the San Rocchini, so these people that almost acritically copy the formal, let's say,
visuality.
The formal aesthetics and so on of San Rocco. And this is of course partially true. At the same time, I don't know. He says like before San Rocco there was like a sort of lack of sort of exhausted aesthetic panorama that was made of renderings and more and more sophisticated renderings that San Rocco managed to completely erase and start from scratch with drawing and so on. And now students in European university copy the black and white drawings of San Rocco and so on. I'm not completely, I don't completely agree with this thing, with this reading. Or I mean, I agree, but we have to understand that 10 years passed and many things happened, and I don't know. It was also a good. I mean, it was a novelty in the beginning. It was not a novelty because we didn't invent anything. It was just a rediscovery of a sort of principle of representation and of condition. So Niccolò talks about this, and of course San Rocco is a bunch of people that somehow have in common the idea that architecture is not invented every day. It relies on a specific knowledge that we can call architecture, that is made of buildings that have been built or designed through time, since the beginning of times. And our approach, or at least my personal approach with my office, is really like free in the appropriation and interpretation of these examples, not as a sort of philological interpretation of references. References is sort of another thing. There is a simple copy, which is the idea of appropriating someone else's ideas, not ideas, but someone else's design, someone else's architecture, and I just think that the idea of novelty, of let's say this quest for novelty, just hides originality in a way, is a sort of alibi for ignorance, in a sense that not knowing architecture, you are convinced that you are just proposing a new thing, but it's really difficult to find new things. Then, I don't know, using old things, you can also reach to new uses of them. But yeah, this is I don't know, it's a really long and complex thing, but this is basically the idea. And I don't know, I don't have this kind of dogmatic relationship to the architecture of the past, in a sense that all architecture is, in my opinion, contemporary, in a sense that being here, it's available, and that's it. Why can't we use these forms, these inventions, these strategies, and I mean, this could be maybe the more direct examples of what I'm saying.
Yeah,
yeah,
sure.
Why did the cone have one microphone? The cone? Recording the interviews?
He recorded the interviews, yeah.
Oh, I see, okay.
Yeah, because
I
they
was
want.
wondering if the acoustic qualities were not enough.
The acoustic qualities were not really good, I have to be honest. In the sense that if you, I didn't think about the acoustic quality at all. I was afraid that having a wooden structure with this kind of shape that is circular and so it doesn't break the sound waves and so on, something was going to happen, but it was totally unpredictable in the, let's say, the time that that took for the development of the project. I just didn't have time to explore this thing. But of course, being a space for a talk, for conversations, this was an important feature. So we needed the microphone to amplify the voice, and at the same time also to record it. The need of the amplification of the voice was not only for the bad qualities of the acoustic of it. I mean, bad qualities. It was strange because if you get into the empty cavea, I sit on one side and you sit on the opposite side, and even if we talk of a very low voice, we hear each other. But I don't hear the guy who's sitting in the center of it for some not strange reasons. But also there was another component that was the noise of the city around. There were many cars passing by. From time to time you hear the ambulance or something like this. And this was really interesting, in my opinion, to have all this noise inside the space, like overlapping to the space of the conversation, but at the same time was we had to manage it somehow, you know, so we need to have an amplification in order to not be overwhelmed by this other noise.
I never visited the, what did you say, the
Teatro Anatomico.
Okay, yes. What are the acoustic qualities of
The Teatro Anatomico is covered. I mean, it's covered with a solid roof, so the acoustic quality is much better because it's not so dispersive. But the textile structure, the aerostatic structure is not so functioning in this sense. No, it's not really contributing to the acoustics. It's dispersing it. So it was not a really well-working machine, I have to admit. It was more, I mean, its quality was more spatial and visual, not acoustic at all. And that is something I learned, and if I had to build in another time, I would try to compensate this, but in this case was not so good. In the case of the Teatro Anatomico, well, there you had the Teatro Anatomico too was mainly a machine for vision than for hearing. No, you had to look at the procedures and learn the procedures by looking at the teacher explaining them to you. Not so much about conversation.
When I heard you talking about this theoretical condition concerning tradition, history, and everything, I personally identify myself a lot of this position of saying that the architectural knowledge should refer to an accumulative knowledge of the past and going back and looking at our traditions and so on. But at the same time, when I look at your projects, I see that there's a line that it's very rational and everything, and then it becomes very Italian. It has this kind of this very Italian design to it. And
Italian?
Italian.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Italian.
You know, like the way the window is designed, the way things, but it's very Italian thing. And in general, like when I heard lectures, even outside Brazil, I've seen this strain of argument of referring to the hermeneutics of the discipline as a way of rationalizing it and reducing arbitrarity and so on. Here in Brazil, we have authors and architects who have, along the modernist tradition, worked along this line of thought also. But how do you deal to compensate with arbitrarity? Do you, how, like, this discourse, it embraces the existence of arbitrarity, you know, of some sort of like a field that is indeterminate for artistic expression or something like that, or is something that is not considered?
I must say that most of the time, this compensation that you're talking about is not enough, no, in my opinion. I mean, it's in terms of I don't know, rationality, functionality of the building, and so on. Here we're talking about small temporary buildings, and you can take the risk of also going out of a sort of rational thought and produce something that, as I already said, maybe it's not completely working, and it's an experiment, and next time it will be improved and so on. In general, yeah, I think I'm quite influenced by, let's say, the Italian tradition, also rational tradition, and so on. But I don't. I don't. I mean, I'm part of a generation that was born and studied with the last, let's say, masters of the Italian tradition with Rossi. I had a chance to study with Rossi, with Aimonino, with I don't know. Huh?
Brands.
Yeah, with Branzi, that was completely another, let's say, yeah, or with Tafuri, no? But that was really a moment of rupture, of break. They all died in that years. They all disappeared, and they were substituted by the sort of a critical continuator of their line of thought, you know, that just brought their and for my generation that was a moment of let's say strong rejection, no, of strong let's say critique of that line of thought. So somehow, let's say, the idea for us was rediscovering this this tradition, but in a way freed from the burden of some sort of dogmatic repetition of things, no? So rediscover them, taking somehow on ourselves the risk of this rediscovery, you know, of starting anew. Like, I don't know, in San Rocco we talked about authors like Grassi, like Canella, or that in a specific moment in our formation was almost forbidden to nominate them, no? Because they were already like so exhausted and at the same time hated, and because they built this sort of cage, this sort of yeah, intellectual cages. And now, I don't know, after a certain time, it's interesting and somehow I don't find the word, but it's a new thing to rediscover them and to start to think about them anew. I don't know if I responded to it. But these are my thoughts around this question.
Alguém tem mais alguma pergunta? Pode ser em português também.
Maybe this last thing that you put and John asked, it's very easy to think about our condition here in São Paulo. Maybe the things we were talking some days ago. It's even a pity that some of our teachers, I don't know, they are not here, but we can easily identify rediscovering process around the 9th generation. That, for example, Paulo Mendes da Rocha was a professor in USP, and no one went to class with him. But then this rediscovery starts to be homogeneous too. I don't know if we can think about the idea of a school, but also the reproduction and the acritical reproduction of lines of thoughts. And I don't know, this is not even a question, it's more like a comment. But I don't know, I think I can say for myself, maybe Luis too, and some friends here, but we are in this moment to look some things back and try to discover and rediscover other things too. And that's why it's important to have this conversation here and how can I say, this network bigger. I think this is a.
Yeah, I think what I feel was the same that we also, and here you say, I can see how the perspectives are kind of very similar because it's like we have tendencies in the lines of discussion that happens here in Brazil, then you have tendencies in Italy, then you have in many other places, and there is a tendency to, from time to time, architecture allows itself to become just an aesthetic repetition, just it stops and then it just becomes a repetition of itself, a reproduction, that's the word I was looking for.
Yeah.
And then comes times when people have to stop it and take back the original lines of argument when things were a little bit more critical and reframe the discipline so it gets on track of critical discussion once again.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I agree. What I can add from my perspective is just that once you recognize what you call a tendency or maybe a sort of common ground that is present between you and other of your generation and so on. An important thing to do is to formalize it somehow, to give shape to it, because the risk is that if it's not formalized, then it becomes a repetition, it becomes a sort of fashion, it becomes something easy to then waste and make old in few years. So for us, in the beginning, the idea of establishing a new magazine, San Rocco, was this idea of creating a space for the debate of these ideas that we felt were somehow present in our productions, and to give shape to this, to establish a debate, to maybe expand this debate and export it, not export it, but try to confront with with other people on the other side of the ocean, and or just across the boundary of your country. That makes the thing interesting for me. And makes me think that San Rocchini effect then is nothing so, is a sort of collateral effect, but your intentions became clear and became somehow visible and tangible and so on. You tried to say something. The idea of, let's say, of stopping the magazine after a few years was just for the fact that we felt that we have a number of things to say, let's say, a number of arguments, and that's it. It doesn't go on forever. It's just not just a tired repetition of a format that you found successful and you want to perpetuate all life long. You have a number of arguments, you expose them, you try to promote them, you are being criticized, and that's it. And then it stops, and I don't know.
No, I think it's a very good this idea of formalization and giving form to something.
Yeah.
It's the most important thing about this exhibition or maybe this tiny book. It's not our goal to explain the exhibition or to explain the tiny book, but to make an exhibition here in São Paulo about pictures of models is something important to us, because this is a way to discuss something, to put something, to formalize it. Yeah. And some people ask, but are they built projects? And I don't know, it doesn't matter. They are here and we are talking about, 1 hour of them.
Mm-hmm.
Did you agree that your language is very Italian? Eu não sei o que disseste, mas disseste que o trabalho dele era muito italiano.
Yes.
mas que elementos mais ou menos? Eu queria perceber mais ou menos. I want to know what do you mean by saying that, and if you agreed that your work was very Italian, because you said you were influenced by your teachers, but do you agree that your work is very Italian?
Yeah, I agree.
You agree?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's because as he showed that there's a lot of stuff that we could think about Aldo Rossi approaches, we could think about I don't know, even the Memphis group way of showing, creating images. I think this is a good topic to go on, how to build the architectural images.
Yeah.
On the Facebook event, we put a picture of Miss Van der Rohe drawing charcoal. No, because yeah, I'm not.
I mean,
yeah, but it's a way to think how to render images. And since we were talking here about this San Rocco movement against renders, against software, super hyper reality stuff that happens to be, how can I say, obsolete very quickly. So maybe it's a topic that you could go on.
No, just to elaborate a bit on this, I think my work is really Italian. I mean, I'm not carrying the flag of Italian pride, in my work. But if you ask me, I have to say yes, because I think there are components of also on the way I design, on the way I use the drawing, on the way I use the tools of representation, and on a series of references, of course, that make my work maybe recognizable as Italian. I mean, I'm happy if that's the case. I think, I mean, you study with masters, and you have, of course, your moment of complete refusal of them, because you feel the dogmatic cage in which you are immersed. But then, once you are a bit more mature and you have acquired your distance from them, maybe I think even involuntarily, as a sort of instinct, the years of formation are present in my works, and I cannot get rid of them anyway. I cannot avoid something about the drawing, about the symmetry, about pure forms, about windows or door holes, openings, or something that. But yeah, I don't want to just talk about formal aspects, but I think the most Italian aspect of my work is a specific relation of architecture towards the city. That is maybe an heritage of course, of the what are still the main books that have been written in the 60s in Italy about architecture and the city. I think that is my. I mean, if I confront my practice with practice of other people, I cannot say now Brazilian practice, but what I feel is that the particular relationship between the object of architecture that you are designing and all the considerations about the city are specific. There is a precise relationship with all the problems and consequences of the urban studies in Italy. That for many years they tried to to tell you that if you make a good urban analysis, then you almost automatically end up in doing a great project, because it was sort of consequential, and we just discovered that it's not, because one activity is, I mean, the architectural project and process is an exclusive activity, no? That after having accumulated a series of information, just erase 90% of them and just focuses on something. But I think that this relationship between the urban or the city, more than the urban environment, the city, because the city is another thing. No? In Italy we have a different idea of the city. And the architecture that is in the city is still really present, and maybe marks one of the aspects of the Italianity of my project.
The last work maybe really curious about the political landscape in Italy right now.
Yeah.
So you have a right-wing populist government.
Yeah.
Has that changed the way architects are doing their work, and do you feel there's a cultural response to that?
Ooh. No, I don't think that the time of changes for architecture is so quick. And since in Italy we are in a sort of permanent campaign, because right now we are in a government crisis, because this majority that was populist and fascists, let's say, together, it's now broken, and now we have to reinvent a new majority, and it's happening so quickly that I wouldn't say that the effects on architecture are so direct, no? But for instance, this government, the last government we had, managed to completely change the rules of the Mediterranean Sea. Not the Mediterranean Sea, but the area of the Mediterranean that is including Italy, because they made this wall really present politically and with legislative acts of closing the harbors and not letting the migrants. There are boats full of people that are stuck some miles away from the Italian coast because they are not allowed to enter, and they stay there for days and days and days, and that for me is a quite tangible effect on architecture. If we want to talk about, on another scale of architecture, that is the architecture of the coast, that is the architecture of the Mediterranean itself, but it's really it changed. It's like from one day to another, you build a new wall, a new border, new barrier that works in a completely different way. Now, I don't know, there is a government crisis, and we don't, and also the fight between the two parties on these legislations, because common sense would say that the main thing is to save people that is abandoned in the sea. But then there is a sort of populist fight against Europe, because we have to carry on our shoulder the burden of all the migration that come to Europe passing through Italy. And these positions are used as campaign statements, no? They are just, and since in Italy we are always in a political campaign, because the stability of the government is not visible since Berlusconi, basically. So now we are in this condition in which every day, I close the ports, I open the ports, I let the people pass, you know, I keep them some miles away from the coast, and that's design problem, let's say, if we want to talk about design in larger terms.
Queria falar duas coisas, só acho que esse último trabalho que o Matteo estava falando, o cemitério, vai estar na próxima Bienal de Arquitetura, que acontece aqui em São Paulo daqui a um mês, mais ou menos. E o outro aviso é que a gente está vendendo essa publicação e, por mais singela que ela seja, é um jeito de também ajudar a gente a continuar fazendo as coisas. Então, se puder contribuir, assim, a gente agradece.
Thank you.